morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Good. Thank you for joining us today. And this is the Bay Area Marine Ecology class at St. Joseph Notre Dame High School in Alameda, California.
Awesome.
We thank you for coming and joining us today and sharing with us.
So my name is Jill Ashey. I'm a PhD student here at University of Rhode Island over on the East Coast. And I am currently doing my PhD in coral reef science. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about coral reefs and what they are and what makes up a coral. And then I'm going to talk kind of a little bit about my specific path in science. Yeah, so first I kind of want to start out with what is a coral. They come in all of these crazy different shapes and sizes and with lots of branches. Some look like brains, some look really weird. But what is a coral? So a coral, I like to think of a coral as a plant, an animal, and a rock. So the rock part of the coral is the calcium carbonate skeleton that it builds. So all corals build some sort of calcium carbonate skeleton, and they build it in all these different crazy shapes. And then the animal part of the coral is what's called a coral polyp. And a coral polyp is essentially, it looks like an upside down jellyfish almost that's stuck on the coral skeleton itself. And it's kind of waving its tentacles around, doing its thing, being an animal. And corals are related to things like jellyfish and sponges and different things like that. And then the plant part of the coral is the tiny algae that live in its tissues. So there's actually algae that live in the coral tissues, and algae are plants, so they can photosynthesize. And when it photosynthesizes, all of those photosynthetic products that the algae is making is actually going towards the coral to give it energy and nutrients. And so the coral animal is giving the algae a nice place to stay, a nice home, and then the plant is giving the coral all of its energy and nutrients. So that's what's called a symbiotic relationship. And so based on this symbiotic relationship, corals can grow to all crazy different shapes and sizes and make beautiful reefs. But what do these reefs actually do? So they do a lot of things. One of which is provide habitat for more than 25% of marine life that we know of. They also generate billions of dollars through tourism, so people fly all over the world to go and visit beautiful coral reefs and to snorkel on them, to dive on them, to fish on them. So that generates money for those specific countries that the coral reefs are in. They also provide food for humans and animals. So a lot of animals in the ocean rely on coral reefs as its food source, essentially. So certain fish live there, eat other fish. There's actually specific types of fish that actually eat the coral themselves. They're called corallivores instead of like herbivore or omnivore. It's corallivore, but anyway. And a lot of fisheries are based on or are based around the fish that coral reefs host. So a lot of human fisheries are based around corals. They also protect beaches from hurricanes and erosion. So if you imagine a hurricane is coming at land, essentially, and all of this wave energy is traveling towards land. And when that wave energy hits land, it's going to hit it really hard and it's going to do some significant damage. But if there's a coral reef blocking the land, the wave energy is going to hit that coral reef first and take the brunt of that wave energy. So that when when that wave action or that big storm comes and hits the land, it's going to be less destructive, essentially, and kind of protect the land a bit more. And they also contribute to new things like new medicine developments. There's constantly being different compounds and different medicines that are synthesized from corals or organisms that live on coral reefs. People have done things like using the coral skeleton itself for bone grafts, which I think is pretty cool. So lots of fun stuff that a coral can do. And coral reefs are kind of distributed all throughout the world. Obviously, they're more of a tropical, they prefer a more tropical climate, but they are truly all over the world. There's also temperate coral reefs, which we don't know as much about. And there's also things like deep sea coral reefs, which again, we don't know that much about. And that's kind of starting to be explored a bit more. Corals are kind of in danger from global climate change, and all of the things that we're doing to the environment have a big effect on corals. So on the right-hand side of this picture, you can kind of see corals. They look brownish. That brown color, the algae that lives within their tissues, gives them that brown color. And so on the left side, you see happy brown corals hanging out in the water. And then on the right side of the picture, you see what's called a bleached coral. So a bleached coral is essentially a coral that does not have its algae anymore. And so the coral tissue itself is translucent. And so when the algae is not there, you can just see right through the tissue to the skeleton. And coral bleaching happens for a couple different reasons, but mostly because when water temperatures increase, the coral gets really stressed, and that symbiotic relationship that it has with its algae doesn't really work so much anymore. The coral gets stressed. The coral's like, I'm so stressed in this hot water, like, get out of here, algae. I need you to leave right now. And so it essentially kicks the algae out of its tissues, kicks the algae out of its home. But when the coral's doing that, it's essentially giving up most of its main source of nutrients, its main source of energy. And so if the coral doesn't get the algae back, if temperatures don't cool down and the coral doesn't get the algae back, the coral will eventually starve to death, essentially. And so this is happening all over the world now. You guys may have seen it this past summer. There was really bad bleaching events going on in Florida and the Caribbean, where the water temperatures increased really high, really early in the summer, much earlier than people expected. And so that led to a lot of widespread bleaching and widespread mortality of corals. So yeah, like I said, coral bleaching is becoming more and more common, which is unfortunate. But lots of other things can also affect coral reefs, like ocean acidification. So the carbon that we're putting into the atmosphere, the carbon dioxide we're putting into the atmosphere, gets absorbed by the ocean, making the ocean more acidic. Those acidic conditions can negatively impact coral. It can make their skeletons harder to grow because it's essentially just dissolving their skeleton. So a lot of negative stuff. They're affected by things like pollution, things like runoff, like agricultural runoff, for example. They can be affected by like the nutrients and the pesticides that are in that, so that can affect them as well. Also, all the plastic that we're putting into the ocean, that can also affect corals. It can get kind of tangled on coral reefs and kind of smother them. But there's also, as you guys probably know, microplastics in the ocean. And corals, there are some studies that are coming out now where corals are actually feeding on microplastics. So they're actually like using their tentacles to grab food out of the water, and some of those food is microplastics. And so not ideal. But I like to think of what can we do to help corals. And so you guys live in California, obviously. I don't know how close you are to the coast. I don't know anything about California, if I'm being honest. But what can we do? We can do things like recycling and conserving water, kind of preventing pollution, avoid using pesticides. You can also do things like volunteer for a beach cleanup, make sure there's not as much plastic in the ocean. And then if you ever visit a coral reef, keep corals safe when you actually visit them. So do things like don't touch the coral reef. I know that the corals are super pretty, but don't touch them. They're animals and they're alive and they don't like to be touched. If you're diving or if you're snorkeling or swimming around, try not to kick them or hurt them or anything like that. You can do things like wear reef safe sunscreen, which is made with specific minerals that aren't as harmful to corals as like regular sunscreen is. So lots of different things we can do to help corals, even if we don't live right beside them. Cool. So now I'm going to kind of move into my scientific journey, if that's okay. If anybody doesn't have any questions right off the bat.
Does anybody have any questions about the bleaching of the coral reefs?
What is there like a estimate on like how much of the coral reefs have been like much damage has been done to coral reefs? Is there like
Yeah, it's estimated that I think by like 2100 or something like that, they estimate that 90% of the coral reefs will be dead essentially if we don't curb carbon emissions sooner. But it kind of ranges from place to place, like places like Florida and like the Florida Reef Tract has been hit particularly hard, and I think there's only maybe like 5% of that reef left compared to like the 1980s or something like that. But places like depends. It's places like Australia or some other places in the Pacific, they can typically recover a bit faster depending on the species of coral. But I would say at this point in time, like at least 50% of the corals are gone when you're thinking about like over the past 50 years, I would say, which is really sad.
What happens when all the corals are dead? Like, how would that affect our lives?
So, like I said earlier, corals they provide a lot of services for us, just in terms of like habitats for other animals. They support different fisheries. They support a lot of other animals in their life cycle. They support like new medicine and stuff like that. So essentially all of those services would disappear. So for example, say we're depending on, or say a certain country is depending on a certain fish that for part of its life cycle lives in coral reefs. Say as like a juvenile, it lives in coral reefs because coral reefs can protect it as it grows up. And so if that fish doesn't have those coral reefs anymore, then it's likely to be eaten or it's likely to die. And so it won't make it into the adult stage, and essentially that fishery will be decimated essentially. But it's also, I don't know, I think sometimes it's difficult to know what the like direct impact on us will be, people who maybe don't live so close to coral reefs. But I do think that everything in the ocean is a massive ecosystem and it's all kind of connected. So if one part of the ecosystem that is supporting over 25% of marine life just kind of disappears and crumbles away, then I think it'll have cascading effects that we may not at the moment be able to predict because we just don't know yet, essentially.
Can we restore coral reefs?
Yeah, that's actually, yeah. So there's a couple different projects right now and people in the field that are trying to do that. And so there are a lot of places or a lot of organizations, I should say, that actually will grow corals on land in tanks or grow corals like just on land, and then they'll essentially outplant them to the reefs so that they can grow in the reef. There's also people who are doing work to genetically engineer super corals, so corals that are really resilient and resistant to things like heat stress or like pollution or ocean acidification. So people are trying to kind of genetically modify coral because coral is a very slow growing animal and it takes a while for it to become reproductively mature. So it is hard for the reefs to repopulate naturally when we're killing them off so quickly. And so we're trying to kind of genetically modify coral or to essentially like select for coral that will be more resilient to future stress. But there's a lot of people working on that kind of research right now in terms of like how can we best what are the best ways that we can help save coral and protect coral, and like what are is there any sort of way that we can do this on a large scale, or is this mostly just going to be kind of smaller scale things? it's hard to know, but there are a lot of different organizations that are doing stuff like that. So now I'm just going to talk about my scientific journey real quick. So I actually grew up in New Jersey, also on the East Coast. I've just been up and down the East Coast for my whole life. So I grew up in New Jersey. I went to high school in New Jersey. I actually wasn't very good at science in high school. I just was bored by it. I don't know. I wasn't interested at all by it, and my teachers weren't as cool as your teachers, and they were just kind of yeah, Jill, you're not really that good at science, and I was like, okay, that's fine. But I was really good at reading and writing, and that's kind of what I like to do. And so when I went to college, I wasn't really interested in science, and I actually went to college as an English major, and then based on that, I went to school as an English major for the first year, and then I went to the College of William and Mary, which is in Virginia, also on the East Coast. And when I was there, it's a relatively smaller school, smaller liberal arts school, and I had to one of my requirements for college was to take a lab course, a scientific lab course. And I was like, ugh, this sounds disgusting and not fun at all. But I think I was just I have to take it. So I guess I'll just take intro to biology and take the lab course as well. And so I took that class and I actually really loved it. The professor was super engaging, and he was really kind and really opened my eyes to all of the different things that you can do with a biology degree. And so based on that one class, I ended up changing my whole major. I just switched my major to biology, which at the time was a big gamble for me, but it paid off, so I'm okay with it. But once I had changed my major, I then kind of wanted to get involved in research because I knew that I was interested in research, and I enjoyed reading and learning and kind of asking questions about science. And so I knew I wanted to get involved in research. And luckily, the William and Mary has a marine science campus called the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, or VIMS. And so I was able to get involved with research there as an undergrad student. And William and Mary is right at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. And so I was able to do a lot of work in the Chesapeake Bay, and I did a lot of work with oysters. So this is kind of a couple pictures of me doing all sorts of my science with oysters. I was able to run a few projects of my own independent projects. I was able to learn a lot about the scientific process. It was a really great experience. And I was asking questions about how does the oyster's history affect its physiology? How does it affect its growth? How does it affect its response to stress? So I was really interested in how does the past, or the oyster's past, affect how it's doing now, or how it might react to things in the future. And that was great. I had a great experience there. And then once I was graduated with college, I was like, ugh, I'm really tired of school. I don't want to go to any more school right now. I need a break. And so I took a gap year in between undergrad and graduate school, which I'm in graduate school now. And during that time, I got a job as a research technician at Mote Marine Lab, which was my first experience in corals and the coral reef world. So there I was able to, so Mote Marine Lab is in Florida, again, on the East Coast, like I said, up and down the East Coast. So Mote Marine Lab is in Florida, and I was working at the field station there, which is in the Florida Keys. And while I was there, this again was my first introduction to corals. I was working with what's called staghorn coral, which is a coral that had absolutely been decimated on the in the Florida Keys, and is a really important reef building coral. And so while I was there, I was doing things like looking into how temperature and ocean acidification affected the coral. in terms of like its physiology, again, like its growth, different things like that. And I really enjoyed doing all the research there. And so that kind of encouraged me to apply to graduate school, which is where I am today. So now I'm at the University of Rhode Island, still studying corals. And my research has focused on both tropical corals and temperate corals. So temperate corals are corals that live in temperate regions of the world. So Rhode Island, obviously not a tropical place. It gets real cold here in winter. But there is a cool coral that lives in Rhode Island waters, and it's called the northern star coral, or Astrangia poculata. And so part of my dissertation that I'm doing now is on that coral. So this coral is really unique because it lives in super, super cold waters, which it's crazy, you know, it's very cold here sometimes. And I don't know, it blows my mind that it lives here. But it is a coral. And another really special thing about this coral is that it, unlike tropical corals, like which I was talking about earlier, how it needs that symbiotic relationship between the algae and the coral, these corals that live in Rhode Island don't necessarily need that relationship. And so they're found actually in both states in the wild. So sometimes, like this picture, you can see this brown coral. That coral has its algae, has its symbiotic algae. And then this white part of the coral, or this white coral up here, that coral does not have any algae in it. But it is still perfectly fine and perfectly healthy. So when I go out and about in the Rhode Island waters, I can see both brown and white colonies of this coral, which is crazy. So I've done a lot of research on this coral in terms of how does it respond to stress on like a physiological and a molecular level. So that's part of my dissertation. And then another part of my dissertation focuses on coral reproduction. So that's kind of what I'm most interested in now as I go forward with my PhD. I'm in my 4th year now, which is wild. So I've been working a lot with coral reproduction. So these tubes of weirdness are actually coral babies. So corals only reproduce certain times of the year, and it's based on water temperature and the lunar cycle. And so for certain corals in tropical locations, we can predict essentially down to the hour when the corals are going to reproduce, which is great because then we can be ready for the corals, collect their gametes, do a bunch of fun, interesting experiments with like the coral larvae and the coral babies and kind of like the next generation of corals. And so I've done a lot of that work in Hawaii, which is kind of like the other part of my dissertation, kind of looks at early coral or like coral embryo, coral larvae, and just early life stages of the coral, and looking at that in terms of a physiological and molecular sense as well. And so that's kind of my dissertation in a nutshell. But yeah, does anybody have any other questions for me? Happy to answer anything.
I just had a question about your last slide, because you said you collected like the baby coral basically. And I was wondering, how do you like, I don't really know, like, how do you do that?
Yeah, so corals reproduce. When corals reproduce, they release their gametes, so their eggs and their sperm, into the water column essentially. And they are positively buoyant, so they float. And so when that happens, we can actually like see the coral egg and sperm like across the surface of the water, because all of the corals are spawning essentially at the same time. And so when we see that, we can essentially go out with either like tubes or other containers or whatever and just scoop it off the top of the water. And that's essentially coral eggs and sperm. And then using the egg and sperm, we can then fertilize them and then raise the coral babies and do all these different kinds of experiments with them.
I have a question. So you're saying all the coral, and I'm assuming there's different genus species of coral. how do they know which sperm goes with which? Like, do they stay within their own species?
I mean, so they sometimes have like the corals are, well, it depends, but at least in the locations that I've worked in, the corals are pretty good about like only a certain species will spawn like 2 days after the full moon or something, and they'll spawn for a period of 3 days. And then, you know, another different type of coral species will spawn like 11 or 10 days after the full moon or something like that. So they're pretty good about like staying separated in that sense. But we have tried experiments in the past where we have like tried to cross fertilize things, and it just doesn't really work for whatever reason. There must be some sort of like mechanism there that prevents that. But there's actually in Florida, there are 2 species of corals. They're called Acropora corals. Acropora is a genus. And those 2 species of corals, though they're different species, same genus, different species, they can fertilize one another's gametes, and that actually produces a whole different species of Acropora coral, which is actually sterile, which is really interesting. So that coral can't actually reproduce, but it is seen in the wild just because these 2 Acropora genuses are so close to one another. So yeah, that's really interesting. But I'm sure it happens in like all over the place, and we just don't understand it yet.
They just have to sign up for a time so that they don't mix.
Exactly.
Really interesting that they did it.
How hard is it to get a PhD?
I'm really tired. I'm exhausted all the time. I'm in my 4th year. A PhD in the US is typically 5 years, between 4 and 6 years usually, but 5 years typically. And it's a lot. It's a marathon. I did 4 years of undergraduate, and then I went to graduate school for another 5 years. So I don't know. But I will say that being in graduate school, at least in the sciences, it doesn't feel like I'm in school necessarily. It feels more like I have a job. I get paid to go to school. My tuition is paid for. I get paid to do the research that I do. I don't have to take as many classes. I have an advisor who's kind of in charge of my research and whatnot. So it does feel more like a job than a student. Like I'm not studying all the time. I haven't taken classes in like at least a year. So it feels more like a job. But it is a lot. It's a lot of work, and I think you really have to enjoy the research that you're doing. I feel lucky because my research kind of enables me to travel quite a bit, which is really nice. But it is definitely difficult, and I'm glad that when I took a year off between undergrad and graduate school, because I think going straight from undergrad into grad school would have been just like way too much for me. It would have been a lot. So I'm happy I took the time off, but it's a lot. But if you're interested in it, I'm happy to talk more about it, and hopefully I'll have my actual PhD in 2 more years, a year, sometime.
I was curious, what bleaching is already done to coral? Is there like any way to restore that already bleached coral, or are you guys like trying to find ways to do so, like restore the already bleached?
Yeah, so when the coral is bleached, it's actually still alive. It's not getting much nutrients and it's essentially starving, but it is still alive. So if the coral can get its algae back quickly enough, then it might survive. But if the coral just essentially doesn't get its algae back in time, it'll die, and the tissue will kind of fluff off and algae will grow all over the coral, and the skeleton will degrade. But so it has been seen like corals bleach and then they can regain their symbionts, and maybe they'll bleach every year a little bit, but they'll either regain their symbiont or their algae, or like the algae will just multiply within the tissue of the coral already. But we are trying to kind of find ways that corals can be more resilient to stress. So trying to do things like selective breeding. Like in Hawaii, we're working with a team of researchers there that do selective breeding. So they specifically select corals that when it gets super warm, the corals didn't bleach. So let's essentially like select for those corals, like have those corals continue to reproduce and like prioritize raising the babies of those more resilient corals up to be adults. So hopefully if we can continue doing things like selective breeding, hopefully corals in future generations will be more resilient to stress. That's the hope.
I had a question. Do you know how to scuba dive?
I
Like,
do know how to scuba dive.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. That is definitely not a big part of my job, but like it is part of my job sometimes. I also do a lot of snorkeling for my job. Yeah, I was lucky enough that Rhode Island has the University of Rhode Island actually has a pretty good diving program. And so I was able to get various certifications. But you do need a special certification in order to do scientific diving. So if you want to do any type of diving for any type of science, you have to get what's called the AAUS certification, which is, I think it's like, what does it stand for? American Association for Underwater Sciences or something like that, which is different than the regular open water or advanced open water certification that you can get. So if you want to do it for science, you have to get a special certification.
Is that required as a class at all? I mean, I know that you need it, but like you do it on your own.
Yeah. It's definitely not required or anything like that. But it is a bonus when you're trying to, get a job or something like that. It's a good added skill.
I had a question. When I was in high school, I wanted to be a biology major. And I felt like I wasn't as interested. Like you said, you were very interested in writing and English and those classes, where I was more into the math and sciences. I wanted to be a biologist. We've looked at some of the research papers that you were a part of, and like how much time now is spent in writing? Like how important is that in your career path?
So I would say like so much of my time is spent writing. Like such a high percentage of time is spent writing. I am always either writing like papers or like manuscripts or writing like I have to write a dissertation proposal. You sometimes have to write like grant proposals in order to get your research funded. It's a lot of writing, a lot of reading the scientific literature. So I think sometimes people forget that when they're kind of interested in the sciences, that science is a lot of reading and writing. Like writing skills are super, super critical in science. In a way that I'm really happy that I actually was really interested in writing and reading, because I think that that helped me in my scientific career so far. But another skill that I would say has been super crucial for me is coding. So understanding how to code is huge in biology, at least in my field. So I know how to code using a lot of different languages now, and it kind of depends on, the field that you're in and what people like to use. But I think learning the principles of coding and the principles of like statistics and things like that, things that you don't necessarily think of when you think of biology, is super critical, because, I'm now working with a lot of data that is big data, like just so much data, like terabytes of data that I just can't go through by myself. And so I need a computer to do it, or else I'm literally it's impossible for me to look at everything. So I think like if I could give advice on like things to focus on or like skills to focus on, it would definitely be writing and coding. Super critical.
That's interesting with the coding. Yeah.
Yeah, I do a lot of coding. A lot of coding.
What do you plan to do once you get your PhD?
I don't even know. So there's like a couple different paths that you can usually take with your PhD. You can either kind of go on the academic route and become a professor. I don't know if I want to do that yet. I haven't really decided. Or you can do things like work in the government, work for like nonprofit organizations, work at like research institutes, work at places like in aquariums or zoos or places like that, work for the government. So there's a lot of different things that you can do. It's sometimes just difficult to find those things. But I think I'm leaning more toward, I really love doing research, but I don't know if I would thrive in an academic setting. So I think I'd enjoy doing something more like a research institute or something like that. I think because I really enjoy doing research. I think that's like my favorite part of my job, and I would like to continue doing that, but I don't know if I would want to continue to do it in an academic setting like this.
Any other words of advice for people who want to go into the field?
Great question. I think just like getting as much experience as you can, trying different things out, seeing what you like. My very, very first research job actually was monitoring frog movements in the woods and like the lake next to my college. And so that's not what I ended up doing, obviously, but I'm glad I had that experience because now I kind of know what I'm more interested in. So I think just like trying different things, seeing what you like, seeing if you want to continue your education after college. Do you want to do a master's degree, or do you want to do a PhD, or do you want to go right into the workforce? Thinking about those types of things and thinking kind of where you'd be happiest. I don't know. I really enjoy science though. It's super fun, but definitely writing and coding.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you guys. I appreciate all your questions. Thank you.
And best of luck in finishing up your PhD.
Thank you very much. Hopefully soon.